Back in the 1990s, time trial bikes got pretty wild. You had funny bikes that had 650C front wheels. You also had the wild Pinarellos being ridden by Miguel Indurain, Bjarne Riis, and Jan Ulrich. You also had DIY rocket ships like Old Faithful made by Graham Obery. But if you ask me, the coolest bike ever made is still the Lotus Sport 110, which is why I am so excited that we have one here in the TPC Museum. This is our 1995 Lotus Sport 110. It is owned by a former pro roadie, Olympian, and Boulder local named Colby Pearce. And in 1995, he actually set the American hour record at 50.191 kilometers on this very bike. Now the hour record, it might be what the Lotus Sport is the most famous for, but before we talk about that, let's back up and take a closer look at this beautiful machine. Now, what makes the Lotus Sport so iconic to me is this carbon fiber monocoque Z-shaped frame. It was designed by this guy, Mike Burrows. He was an English bike designer. Now the thing Mike Burrows might be best known for is designing the giant TCR, the world's first compact road frame. And he knew sort of the potential aerodynamic benefits of building a monocoque frame shaped like this, and was working on this design for a really long time. So this Z-shaped monocoque frame was pretty clever because by removing the down tube, it becomes more aerodynamically efficient because it only has to cut through the air twice, at the fork and at the seat tube. And this exposed bottom bracket shell is actually shaped a bit like the bow of a ship to help smooth air going over these massive chainstays in the rear. Not only that, but if you look at this bike head on, it is super narrow. It is less than 2 inches wide. And I actually put a set of calipers on this integrated seat mast up here, and it is less than 9 millimeters thick. So this bike is super thin. So Lotus is a car manufacturer, and they came into the picture because one of their test drivers was actually a cyclist. And he encountered this design when he was visiting Mike Burrows' shop. And Lotus, they have ties with Formula One, so they have a lot of experience with aerodynamics and composites. They could provide wind tunnel testing and carbon fiber molding. And they actually decided to buy the rights to this project in 1992. And they made the first version of this bike called the Lotus Sport 108. Now this bike was used by a pretty famous rider, Chris Boardman, in the 1992 Olympics, and he won the 4,000 meter pursuit on it and set a new world record. After that success, Lotus kind of saw, the potential benefits of making a production version. And that ended up being what we see here at the Lotus Sport 110. They made a pretty small batch of these bikes, and then they contracted out production to this company called Aerodyne Space Technologies. You can see this sticker here, this was an Aerodyne made bike. They're a South African company. They also have some ties with Formula One. And the main difference between the Lotus Sport 108 and then this Lotus Sport 110 is that the 108 used what was called a monoblade design. So it had a single-sided fork and a single-sided rear end with a single chainstay on the right side. To make things easier for production, the 110, it has a dual-sided fork and 2 chainstays in the rear. Just keeps things nice and easy for manufacturing. One thing that I think is really cool too is that the 110 also has these interchangeable rear dropouts. You could switch between road spacing and track spacing. And if you switch to road spacing, you have a derailleur hanger. You also have all this internal cable routing. You have brake mounts. So this really was a bike designed for the track and the road. So this newer version, the Lotus Sport 110, is the bike that Chris Boardman used in 1994 when he won the Tour de France Prologue and set the record at the time for the fastest tour stage in history.
On his famous Lotus bike, Boardman rode the 7.2 kilometre course between Lille and Dura-Lille at 55.152 kilometres an hour.
He also set the absolute hour record on this bike in 1996, but we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. I want to talk a little bit about Colby's bike here. This bike is obviously very fast, but that means it's also very expensive. In $1995, a frame set costs $3,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $6,000 for a frame set in today's money. Colby, he bought this at full retail. And you know, that makes a lot of sense if you're trying to set a new American record. There's a lot of pretty interesting details with Colby's build here. He's using this sort of pretty classic Mavic 631 Starfish crankset. He painted it black to match the rest of the bike, but what I find really interesting is that these are 175 millimeter cranks, so they're longer than like the traditional 165 millimeter track cranks, and they actually don't clear these massive chainstays. So what Colby did was he actually filed a beveled edge into the end of the crank arm here to get them to clear, and if you look, there's about a millimeter of clearance between the end of the crank and the chainstay, and if you push hard enough, you can actually get it to touch the frame. So it is really, really tight back there. Now these wheels, the front is a carbon head 3 tri-spoke. The rear is really interesting. It is called a Russian disc. These are made of Kevlar. They're pretty popular in track cycling. Now they usually have this like insignia on them that says 666 in this Cyrillic font. If you look really close, you might be able to see it, but this wheel has been spray painted again to match the bike. These are really interesting too because they don't have spokes. It's Kevlar that's been tensioned like a drum. And when you're riding this bike, it is super loud, especially on the road. All the shifts, bumps in the road, they just sounds really cool. At the front end here, we have these custom Vision aluminum aero bars. They measure 38 centimeters outside to outside, so decently narrow. And then Colby used this Look Ergo adjustable stem. It helped them get the bars nice and low to where they're almost in line with the top tube. Now, Chris Boardman's Lotus, the cockpit was actually mounted to the fork crown to get them low enough. But obviously, for the production versions that regular people could buy, they wanted a more traditional threadless stem setup. Just makes things a lot nicer and easier. And now that we've come back to Chris Boardman, let's talk a bit about his hour record and why this bike ultimately got banned. Now in 1996, Chris Boardman set a new hour record at 56.375 kilometers. And that record, it stood for nearly 30 years until it was broken in 2022 by Filippo Ganna. And the reason it stood for so long was because it was essentially nullified by the UCI. Now what happened was in the 90s, there was this arms race going on. People were creating these wild bike frames. They were adopting really crazy riding positions, and the UCI, they decided it was getting out of hand. So in 96, they drafted the Lugano Charter. It didn't get ratified until 2000. So the Lugano Charter, it created guidelines restricting frame shapes and dimensions, essentially outlawing radical frame designs and riding positions like the Lotus Sport 110. Amazingly, 30 years later, this bike still tests pretty favorably against the best aero bikes we have today, which does make me wonder, where would we be now if, you know, rules hadn't stifled progress? Despite that, you still see pretty crazy frame designs in triathlon where the UCI doesn't have control. So they have a lot more, you know, crazy frame designs. You've got bikes like, you know, the Cadex that Christian Blumenfeld rides. You got the Cervelo P5X. And then you also have a brand like Ventum that makes a Z-shaped frame that looks a lot like this. So that innovation is still alive and well on that side of the sport. Still, I think the Lotus Sport 110 is better looking than all those crazy triathlon bikes. It is one of the most iconic bikes ever made, and in the 90s, it was the undisputed king of speed. Colby, he told us that it had this special effect on you as a rider.
And there aren't very many bikes that I've had that I've really had an emotional attachment to, but this one, I think I rose to the best of my own abilities, and this bike kind of helped me do that. That speed, I think, also inspired the best out of me, because you're out there on this super fast bike, you don't want to look like a jackass and get beat.
The Lotus Sport 110 really represents everything I love about cycling, man and machine meshing together as one to achieve something great. All right, so before we go, I want to give a big thanks to Colby Pearce for loaning us his awesome Lotus Sport 110. This seriously was my dream bike when I was a kid, and it's so awesome that I get to be up close with it and touch it. And if you have a vintage find of your own, be sure to share that with us. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.